You know, I've never actually used a retro handheld before. For those not in the know, these are purpose-made gaming handheld devices made for running older retro titles via emulation. It's an emergent market, and to be honest, they seem pretty exciting. You see a bunch of YouTubers like Retro Game Core, Nerd Nest, Tech Dweeb, all of them cover retro handhelds, and it makes me wonder, am I really missing out? Well, coincidentally, Mech DIY reached out to see if I want to check out one of their retro handheld devices, and honestly, why not, right? So they sent over one of these, the TrimUI Smart Pro. So now for the big question, is this the retro handheld that I should have picked? And is the retro handheld market this unsung hero of the handheld gaming market? One that I should sing the praises of? Let's find out. Mech DIY reached out to me and asked if I want to try out one of their retro handhelds, namely the TrimUI Smart Pro. No money has exchanged hands, and they're not viewing this video ahead of time either. So before we get into the retro handheld, let's get into this case that they sent over to me. This is a case they made for the TrimUI Smart Pro, or at least they put their branding on it, and it's a pretty neat case. It opens up, and it has a pocket for the handheld itself, and a small pocket for, well, whatever cables you want. I don't know of very many cases for this device, so it's cool that they included this for me to review as well. It's a pretty solid case, it fits it just fine. Now let's talk about the unboxing experience of the device itself. The device itself comes in a sort of nifty box. It's nothing special. They also included this 256GB micro SD card. They sell a kit that comes with both the case and a micro SD card, but by default you can buy the device by itself for a cheaper price. This right here is a SanDisk Ultra, and it's one of the cheaper micro SD cards. Personally speaking, I would buy the micro SD card separately, but that's up to you. And underneath all of this is, of course, the actual device itself. It comes fairly well protected. I mean, it's a small, cheaper handheld, so I'm not too concerned about it. But still, and a USB Type-C power cable. And some additional literature in case you need it, and honestly, you might need it. The USB Type-C cable is nothing special, and I've got a bunch of these by this point, so I wouldn't be too concerned with it. Given this device's status as a retro handheld, the controller demands a perfect D-pad, and the D-pad is pretty darn good. Obviously for platformers it's quite good, but what about fighting games? Well, you can roll your thumbs quite easily. I mean, I am kind of biased as I've cut my teeth on Super Turbo, but it's pretty good for some casual fighting game playing. The buttons on the D-pad are also quite clicky, as are the face buttons, and to be honest, I like them this clicky. This feels good. The bumpers and triggers feel good too, though do know that the triggers aren't actually like analog triggers, so keep that in mind. The thumbsticks are where I feel the device falls apart, because the thumbsticks, they don't feel very good. The thumbsticks being recessed into the chassis kind of makes it feel like one of those PSP circle pads. And honestly, it feels like a worse version of that. Like, these use the Vita thumbsticks, literally. And also, I gotta mention, yes, you cannot click these sticks in. This can cause problems for games that aren't retro games, which we'll talk about those later. As someone that knows nothing about these devices, the interface is very easy to use. You have multiple different emulators for multiple different systems, and of course you can always add the ROMs to the interface. If you want to get started, there are great guides out there for getting your ROMs all set up and stuff. It seems like my model came with CrossMix OS pre-installed, so I don't have the base software, so I'm just going to base it off of that. And speaking of ROMs, it's time to talk about why you should probably buy a separate micro SD card. Because the micro SD card that they gave me was full of ROMs. Like, these are the types of ROMs that many would consider to be illegal to download, and yet they were shipped to me directly in a micro SD card. Sure, it saves me a lot of trouble in trying to pick and choose ROMs to run on this system since, they're kind of just already there. But I will say it is kind of illegal here, so probably don't ship these micro SD cards with ROMs. You can ship them with the OS installed, I guess, but not the ROM, right? So let's jump into a game that I'm actually familiar with. So I've tried out the PSP version of Tekken 6, and it's probably the most graphic demanding PSP game out there, besides like the God of War titles. Tekken 6 runs at a solid 60 FPS on actual PSP hardware, but here it runs like half of that. The default setting for this emulator was set to 2x resolution, which clearly this device cannot handle. But as it turns out, it really can't handle Tekken 6 at 1x resolution either, you know, the native resolution of the game itself. But of course, there are other PSP titles that run a lot better, a lot of the 2D ones. As for N64 and Dreamcast, well, it really depends on what games you want to run. Like, surprisingly, Dead or Alive 2 runs okay on the Dreamcast, it just doesn't run at 60 FPS. And believe me when I say fighting games are best played at 60 FPS, like a locked 60 FPS with no frame skipping. As for Super Nintendo and whatnot, I mean, come on now, you all know these work quite well on these devices. I mean, that's probably the reason why people buy these, right? Like, you don't really need to see footage of me playing Super Mario World in this or whatever, right? Even with some snags with emulating high-end PSP or Dreamcast games, or N64 games even, it's a pretty darn good device for playing your retro games. The device by itself is $70, which I think is a pretty darn good price for a system like this. Like for me, this is a pretty solid device for getting started with retro handhelds. It's a pretty solid device for someone like me that's getting started in the retro handheld scene. And at $70 by itself, it's not a huge monetary commitment. But of course, I wasn't given the $70 base model, I was given the $100 model with a custom carrying case and a micro SD card. Now, to be honest, I wouldn't recommend buying the bundle because you can buy the carrying case separately from Mech DIY for like 13 bucks and find a much better deal on a micro SD card. And if you want a guide for setting up your micro SD card for these devices, Retro Game Core has an excellent video and website on this. So now we have to address the elephant in the room, Portmaster. You know, part of the reason why I was excited for these retro handhelds wasn't just because of playing retro games. There's also multiple additional programs and unrelated homebrew that aren't necessarily emulation. The first of which is Moonlight, which has a port for this OS. Moonlight is an application that lets you stream from your own gaming PC to your TrimUI in this case. And to be honest, it's an okay experience. It works for the most part, but a lot of modern games make use of L3 and R3, you know, the stick clicks. And while some games you may be able to get away with not sprinting or whatever, the truth is I wouldn't recommend it at all. And you know, given that my Steam Deck works quite well, I really don't see myself using this for Moonlight streaming at all. But the big daddy software that everyone seems to be talking about when it comes to these retro handhelds is Portmaster. You know, that micro SD card they gave me, well, it included a bunch of ROMs, but it also included a bunch of ports already ready for me to play. The thing here though is that these ports, when you're setting them up for the first time, you need to have your own legal copies of a game. And this SD card has a bunch of those ports already ready for me, which is kind of unfortunate to be honest. Like, I own Celeste, I can do this myself. Same with Balatro. So your usual suspects like Balatro and Celeste run quite well. Well, Balatro runs at a sub 30 FPS it seems. I mean, to be honest, I wouldn't play it because I have like a bunch of other ways to play Balatro, but I do find it weird that Balatro runs at such a low frame rate. But aside from those two, there are a bunch of other surprising ports. Like, did you know that Salt and Sanctuary had a Portmaster port? I didn't know that. Did you know Portmaster also supported visual novels? Like, I didn't know that. None of the retro handheld guys have mentioned visual novel ports. I mean, it's not their forte, but still. Like, you can see right here, there's a port for Clannad right here. But there's also a port for Valhalla Cyberpunk Bartending Action? Wow, I want to play that. And this is where the confusion with Portmaster starts. Portmaster in and of itself isn't like a porting software or some sort of engine or anything like that. No. It's a repository where you can download various ports made by various people for your Linux devices. And naturally, this comes with compatibility differences. Like for example, this Valhalla port shows up on the official website, but when I launch the app on my device, it doesn't show up, and it seems like it's just not compatible with my device. Even if I manually install it, the game just doesn't launch. I've also tried out some other ports that are supposed to work with this device, like the Blue Revolver port. Blue Revolver is a shmup that I really do enjoy, and I can't play it on this device because it doesn't work. I followed the instructions to a T, and unfortunately, it just doesn't seem to work. I'll be reporting this error message to the guy that maintains the port. There's also a port for the Mega Man X8 16-bit demake that was made by a fan. It's a pretty awesome game, and I recommend playing it on whatever device you have. On Portmaster, there's a port for this, and you're supposed to drop the exe in and it's supposed to run, but in my case, it doesn't seem to work. In my experience, a lot of what seems to work are more high-profile indies, like, Celeste, Salt and Sanctuary, Balatro, Cave Story, and for the most part, these are all pretty suitable games to play. But for the most part, you should remember that this is an emulation machine, first and foremost. You're most likely going to be playing some older retro titles, and I'm totally content with that. For the litany of PC games, I have some PC handhelds, and I usually take those with me on the go anyways. Is it sad that some of the Portmaster ports I really wanted to try out didn't work out? Yeah, it is, but at the same time though, it is what it is. So all in all, I can recommend this as a solid entry point for the world of retro handhelds. At least it certainly is for me. I do want to explore more of these devices, and honestly, I might just do so. But you do have to remember the adage, you do get what you paid for, and this is a much cheaper handheld. There's no L3, R3, and software support can be a little nebulous at times, and to be honest, if you're someone that likes the PS2 era or Dreamcast era, then you're likely not going to be playing a whole lot of games from that era. Finding a good retro handheld for a good price is a delicate balancing act because, well, the Steam Deck turns everything upside down because it's a far more powerful PC handheld, and it starts at $400, which is far cheaper than any other PC handheld out there that can run, well, PC games, and a lot of emulation too. At under $100, I think this is a pretty solid choice for retro handhelds, especially if you want to emulate. If you like this video, please press the like button and check out our other videos, and if you like those other videos as well, be sure to press the subscribe button and share the good gospel of high-tech lowlife with your friends. Furthermore, we have a community Discord for enlightened individuals such as you. And if you wish to further support high-tech lowlife, be sure to check out our Patreon page, links in the description.